A cargo ship loaded with semiconductors worth $50 million sits abandoned in Manila Bay. Its destination changed from Los Angeles to Shenzhen at the last minute. In boardrooms across Silicon Valley, executives are frantically rewriting supply chain strategies that took decades to build. Meanwhile, in a gleaming office tower in Makati, Filipino negotiators are fielding calls from desperate American manufacturers offering double their previous rates, only to hear the same response: "Sorry, but we've moved on." This isn't fiction. This is the reality of what happens when nations underestimate the Philippines, and 15 countries are learning this lesson the hard way. Before we dive deeper into this economic earthquake that's reshaping global trade, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories like these that reveal the hidden mechanics of international power. What you're witnessing is perhaps the most dramatic reversal of economic fortune in Southeast Asia, where a country once dismissed as a mere outsourcing destination has systematically dismantled the assumptions of nations that took its cooperation for granted. The Philippines didn't just walk away from unfavorable partnerships, it strategically replaced them with alternatives that these 15 countries never saw coming. By the time you finish watching this, you'll understand how a nation of 7,000 islands managed to leave some of the world's most powerful economies scrambling for alternatives they may never find. The story begins in 2019, when the Philippines controlled nearly 40% of global semiconductor assembly, a position so crucial that disrupting it would send shockwaves through every technology company on Earth. American, Japanese, and European firms had spent decades building their operations around Filipino expertise, creating supply chains so intertwined that separation seemed impossible. These companies treated the Philippines like a permanent fixture in their business models, assuming that cheap labor and strategic location would keep Filipino workers grateful and compliant forever. They couldn't have been more wrong. The first crack appeared when South Korea's Samsung, despite generating billions in revenue from Filipino-assembled chips, refused to transfer advanced manufacturing technology to local partners. Korean executives publicly stated that Filipinos lacked the technical sophistication for next-generation production, a comment that spread across Filipino social media like wildfire. Within months, the Philippine government quietly began courting Chinese semiconductor companies eager to establish Asian production bases outside mainland China. Korean negotiators, who had grown comfortable with their dominant position, suddenly found themselves competing against Chinese offers that included technology transfer, local partnership requirements, and profit-sharing agreements that made Samsung's terms look prehistoric. The domino effect was swift and merciless. Taiwan's Foxconn, which had operated massive assembly plants in the Philippines for over 20 years, discovered that their contracts wouldn't be renewed unless they agreed to establish research and development centers staffed by Filipino engineers. When Taiwanese executives balked at sharing proprietary technology with local talent, they watched in horror as their Filipino workers accepted offers from Vietnamese companies that promised not just jobs, but technical training and career advancement opportunities. Taiwan lost 60,000 experienced assembly workers in 6 months, while Vietnam gained a ready-made workforce that had already mastered the production processes. Japan's experience proved even more devastating. Sony, Toshiba, and Mitsubishi had built their Southeast Asian strategies around Philippine manufacturing, treating the country as an extension of their domestic production capabilities. Japanese management maintained rigid hierarchies that kept Filipino engineers in subordinate roles, despite their obvious competence and growing expertise. When India's Tata Group began recruiting Filipino talent for their Mumbai technology centers, offering senior positions and equity participation, the exodus began immediately. Japan didn't just lose workers, they lost institutional knowledge that had taken decades to develop. Replacing those Filipino engineers with Japanese expatriates cost 3 times as much and took twice as long to achieve comparable productivity. The United States faced perhaps the most shocking reversal. American companies had grown so dependent on Filipino call centers and back-office operations that they treated the Philippines like an offshore extension of their domestic workforce. When the Philippine government introduced new regulations requiring foreign companies to hire Filipino executives for senior management positions, American firms resisted, citing concerns about protecting proprietary information and maintaining operational control. Their resistance lasted exactly 18 months, until they discovered that Mexico had quietly recruited entire Filipino teams for their own business process outsourcing sector. American companies that had paid Filipino workers $5 per hour suddenly faced Mexican competitors employing the same workers for $8 per hour, while offering better working conditions and advancement opportunities. Germany's industrial giants learned equally painful lessons. Companies like Bosch and Siemens had established precision manufacturing facilities in the Philippines, drawn by the combination of skilled workers and lower costs. German engineering culture, with its emphasis on rigid protocols and hierarchical management, clashed repeatedly with Filipino workers who sought greater autonomy and creative input. When Singapore began actively recruiting Filipino manufacturing specialists for their smart factory initiatives, offering partnership opportunities and innovation bonuses, the response was overwhelming. Germany found itself not just losing workers, but watching those same workers become competitors as Singapore's Filipino-led teams began developing manufacturing solutions that outperformed German processes. The pharmaceutical industry witnessed one of the most spectacular collapses of foreign dominance. Switzerland's Novartis and Roche had relied heavily on Filipino chemists and researchers for drug development and clinical testing, paying them a fraction of what equivalent Swiss scientists commanded. Swiss companies maintained strict intellectual property controls that prevented Filipino researchers from receiving credit for their contributions or advancing to leadership positions. When Canada's biotech sector began offering Filipino scientists full research partnerships and publication rights, the migration was immediate and devastating. Switzerland didn't just lose talent, they lost research programs that were years away from completion, forcing them to restart projects from scratch with new teams that lacked the institutional knowledge their Filipino colleagues had possessed. Australia's mining companies experienced their own rude awakening. Firms like BHP and Rio Tinto had employed thousands of Filipino engineers and geologists for mining operations across Southeast Asia, viewing them as capable but ultimately replaceable technical staff. Australian management culture maintained clear distinctions between expatriate executives and local technical personnel, regardless of qualifications or experience. When Chile began recruiting Filipino mining experts for their copper and lithium operations, offering equity participation and management roles, the response exceeded all expectations. Australia watched established mining projects lose their technical leadership overnight, while Chile gained experienced teams that understood both the technical and cultural aspects of Asian mining operations. France's aerospace industry suffered similar devastation. Companies like Airbus and Safran had integrated Filipino engineers into their global design and manufacturing networks, but maintained strict controls over advanced technology access and career advancement. French corporate culture, with its emphasis on educational pedigree and bureaucratic hierarchy, systematically undervalued Filipino technical contributions. When Turkey's aerospace sector began offering Filipino engineers senior design roles and technology partnership opportunities, the exodus began immediately. France found itself not only losing experienced engineers but watching them contribute to Turkish aerospace projects that began competing directly with French designs. The United Kingdom's financial services sector provides perhaps the most ironic example of this global shift. British banks and insurance companies had built massive back-office operations in the Philippines, processing everything from loan applications to insurance claims. British management maintained traditional colonial attitudes that treated Filipino professionals as capable administrators but unsuitable for strategic roles. When Dubai's financial sector began recruiting Filipino finance professionals for senior positions in Islamic banking and fintech development, the response was overwhelming. Britain's centuries of financial dominance meant nothing when Filipino professionals could find better opportunities and greater respect in Middle Eastern financial centers. Italy's fashion and manufacturing industries learned equally expensive lessons. Companies like Prada and Versace had relied on Filipino artisans for high-end production, treating them as skilled labor rather than creative partners. Italian design houses maintained tight control over creative processes, viewing Filipino contributions as purely executional. When South Korea's fashion conglomerates began collaborating with Filipino designers on global collections, offering creative partnership and brand ownership opportunities, the transformation was immediate. Italy watched helplessly as Filipino artisans who had produced their luxury goods for decades began creating competing products that combined traditional craftsmanship with contemporary Asian aesthetics. Netherlands' agricultural technology sector experienced one of the most complete reversals. Dutch companies like Philips and ASML had employed Filipino agricultural engineers for greenhouse technology and precision farming systems throughout Southeast Asia. Dutch management approached these relationships purely as employer-employee arrangements, providing minimal technology transfer or advancement opportunities. When Israel began recruiting Filipino agricultural specialists for their desert farming initiatives, offering research partnerships and technology development roles, the migration was swift and comprehensive. Netherlands lost not just individual workers but entire teams that understood both the technical and cultural requirements for successful agricultural technology implementation across diverse Asian markets. Belgium's chemical industry faced similar disruption. Companies like BASF Belgium had built extensive operations around Filipino chemical engineers and process specialists, treating them as competent technical staff within rigid corporate hierarchies. Belgian management maintained strict separation between strategic decision-making and technical implementation, regardless of individual qualifications or experience. When Qatar began developing their petrochemical sector and actively recruited Filipino specialists for senior technical and management roles, the response was immediate. Belgium watched decades of institutional knowledge walk out the door as Filipino professionals accepted positions that offered both better compensation and greater professional respect. The Nordic countries, despite their reputation for progressive labor practices, weren't immune to this global shift. Finnish companies like Nokia had employed Filipino software engineers and designers for mobile technology development, but maintained clear distinctions between Finnish management and international technical staff. When Estonia began developing their digital government initiatives and recruited Filipino technology specialists for leadership roles in e-governance and cybersecurity, the migration was substantial. Finland discovered that treating international talent as permanent junior partners, regardless of capability, was no longer a sustainable strategy in an increasingly competitive global market. If you're finding these revelations as shocking as they are, you're clearly someone who appreciates the hidden stories that shape our world. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss these deep dives into the forces transforming global economics. The economic impact of these shifts extends far beyond individual companies or sectors. The 15 countries that underestimated the Philippines collectively lost over $200 billion in productive capacity, intellectual property, and market position. More importantly, they lost something that money cannot easily replace: the trust and loyalty of skilled professionals who had contributed to their success for decades. These Filipino workers didn't just change jobs, they brought with them institutional knowledge, cultural insights, and technical expertise that had taken years to develop. The Philippines, meanwhile, has emerged as one of the primary beneficiaries of this global rebalancing. By systematically cultivating relationships with alternative partners and refusing to accept subordinate roles in global supply chains, the country has transformed itself from a passive recipient of foreign investment into an active player in global economic networks. Filipino professionals who once worked as invisible contributors to other nations' success stories are now leading innovation initiatives, establishing new companies, and creating value that benefits their home country directly. The broader implications of this transformation extend well beyond Southeast Asia. We're witnessing the emergence of a new model of international economic relations, where developing nations refuse to accept permanent junior status in global value chains. The Philippines has demonstrated that countries with skilled populations and strategic advantages don't have to remain dependent on traditional powers that treat them as convenient but expendable partners. The 15 countries that failed to adapt to this changing reality now face a harsh new environment where Filipino expertise is available but no longer comes with the assumptions of subordination and loyalty that previous generations took for granted. They must compete for Filipino talent on equal terms, offering genuine partnerships rather than employment relationships, and accepting that the days of treating entire nations as permanent outsourcing destinations are over. The lesson is clear. In an interconnected global economy, no nation can take another's cooperation for granted. Respect, partnership, and mutual benefit aren't just diplomatic niceties, they're economic necessities. The 15 countries that learned this lesson too late are now paying the price, while those that understood and adapted to these changing dynamics are reaping the benefits of genuine international cooperation. The Philippines didn't just replace its economic partners, it redefined the terms on which international economic relationships can exist in the modern world.